Do you want real freedom, real love? Have you felt like you've been wandering in the desert, in the wilderness for years? Do you even believe in the promised land anymore? Well, today on Spirit Inspire, we discuss all of that and more so that we can understand the Exodus as it applies to our lives, so we can wander the wilderness with actual hope in the promised land. On Spirit Inspire, starting right now.
Broadcasting from the Cathedral of the Assumption in Louisville, Kentucky, this is Spirit Inspire. And now, here is your host.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Spirit Inspire. Today, I'm your host, John Soule. Joined with me is my co-hosts, Vincent Ricketts.
Hello.
And Isaac Fox.
Hello, everyone.
And we have a very good, exciting episode today, all about the Exodus. Last week, Vincent and I began talking through the origin of Israel and the meaning and symbolism of what Israel means for the entire world, especially in the present conflict that's happening there. And of course, knowing our prayers continue to remain with the people, but knowing the significance of what Israel means for the world is critical. And we got into Genesis with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, whose name is Israel, of course, after he wrestled with the angel and the story of his reconciliation with his brother Esau, but also the redemption with his family when he reunited with his son Joseph after years as well. So it's a very powerful story which lands the entire people of Israel in Egypt. And now we're ready to discuss a little bit about the Exodus. And maybe this is a new series of sorts. We kind of had 3 or 4 different episodes where we really focused a lot on the story of Genesis, whether we've dwelt in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, or we got into some of the quick details. You can obviously never exhaust Genesis. We could do another 400 episodes on that and never fully grasp it, right? But we can also do the same with Exodus. And these are kind of the two seeds of the gospel. Like if you look at Genesis and Exodus, there's some level of holistic, this is what our faith is about. But Jesus obviously fulfills all of that with the liturgy we have today. So I guess to get started, like what would be some of the initial foundational elements that we should discuss about Exodus that come to your all's minds, or things that are already on your heart to discuss concerning Exodus? Who would like to jump in first?
I'll jump in.
All right, Isaac, go for it.
So you're talking about Exodus like Genesis being a seed or being kind of a foundation, which it really is. And I think that we've talked about this before, how Genesis seems to be all of salvation history in miniature, in seed form. And I think we see that again in Exodus, but with more detail, and now this time. This is the story of deliverance. And so what we need to see, I think, is it's filled with amazing foreshadowings of what is going to happen with Christ in the Gospels. And it's here that we encounter perhaps the single most important person in Jewish history, which is Moses. And he is, of course, a type of Christ. Christ is shown over and over again in the New Testament to be the new Moses, right? Oh, there's so many allusions and references to that.
I mean, even Moses standing next to Jesus at the mountain of Transfiguration, right?
And I think maybe the first thing for me to do is kind of step back and look at the big picture, because what we see at the beginning of Exodus is the people of God who have been in bondage and slavery for almost 400 years, 300 and something. And this speaks, of course, to our human condition post-fall, right? That the original sin, the effects of original sin, the bondage to the sin that we have, and also more particularly not just a random sin, but to the devil, right? You know, there's that, he's kind of that Pharaoh character in a sense, right? And in the midst of this really tragic circumstance for the people of God comes the Messiah, the deliverer. Because Moses, he isn't the Messiah, but he is a Messiah. He is the one sent to deliver God's people. Mm-hmm. And then the end of that story is supposed to be the entrance into the promised land, which we don't get to in Exodus yet.
Which I think surprises some people.
Yeah.
There's always this sense of, oh, we're going to the promised land. We've been delivered from Egypt, and then at the end of the story, it's like, wait, what?
And it takes 40 years.
Right.
Much longer than it should have as far as travel distance is concerned. And so the promised land itself represents both sort of redemption and salvation, but ultimately there's an eschatological element here too of it representing heaven. So the kind of the big picture is slavery, deliverer comes, goal is to get to heaven. And then the details that fit in there all match up with how this really plays out in the New Testament. We're going to have the sacrifice of the perfect lamb. We're going to have the building of the tabernacle. We're going to have the wilderness journeying. We're going to have the Shekinah glory and the announcement of the word of God from
And
the mountain.
is that not Pentecost?
Right? And
Right.
every bit of this happens again in the New Testament. So I think it's just kind of good. That's my 2 cents, is to look back at what is the big overarching picture and realize this really is the story of salvation history, both historically and for each of us as individuals, because we're each, what is that 40 years in the desert? That's a lifespan. That's a generation, right?
Yeah.
So it also speaks to our individual redemption from original and actual sin, and our generation of living through the wilderness struggles. And then, may God bring us to the promised land at the end. And then also for his entire people, the church. So it has kind of historical, individual, and collective
Significance.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. I think of Exodus being kind of connected to all of our lives, because we're all kind of going through intense purgation and need for deliverance today. I look at Exodus as one of those stories that can touch our hearts in unique ways. And for nostalgic purposes, I look at the story of Moses from DreamWorks, or the Prince of Egypt, that cartoon. And while you can diss on cartoons, there's always something significant when you go back to some childhood stories that you watched when you were younger. And I don't know, I look at that movie as like more significant than even like Charlton Heston, which was great and nostalgic in many ways, but could you imagine if they made one with that kind of grandeur, that large, miraculous feel to it, the grand sweeping, similar to like the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings, right? Yeah. The depth of what that is, but then put it into Exodus would be so profound. But that to me is like what DreamWorks like touches on. There's something beautiful. It's not just trying to explain it away with naturalistic scientific explanation, which is fine for those who need something to draw them to God, but I am drawn to God in the larger sense of he's not only powerful in ways of creating the natural world, he can also do things that are utterly unexplainable.
Yeah.
And that story of Exodus doesn't end when they just cross the Red Sea. It's not like, all right, we're good, because that's usually how most movies portray it. Even DreamWorks falls short, right?
Yeah.
They stop at a certain point.
Barely the beginning.
Yeah, it's like 15 chapters in.
It's a critical beginning, right?
Yeah, of course.
It is that sense of deliverance from Egypt and whatever that represents. But then the journey's just started.
Yes.
And it goes through many convoluted twists and turns, lots of mistakes, lots of rebellion, lots of stuff before you get to the final bit.
And the story kind of continues now.
So something... John, talking about foreshadowing, that's a big thing for me. I love seeing how the Old Testament scriptures are fulfilled in the New. It's kind of one of my passions. And we've certainly talked about this a lot in Genesis, but Exodus has got to be my other favorite for that. We see so much of that and in such remarkable detail. But I mentioned a moment ago, Christ appearing as the new or second Moses in the New Testament. And I think that's something that's easy for us to miss because it's not always stated explicitly. We have St. Paul telling us that Christ is the second Adam, right? So we've got that. That's right there in the New Testament. So we can draw that connection then. We certainly see some references to Isaac in the New Testament that are connected to Christ. So we can see he's the fulfillment of the type of Isaac and so forth. And I think that this may be kind of a dual defect. It may be partly just being 21st century Westerners, not in touch with first century Judaism.
Right.
And it may also be a defect of not reading or being sufficiently familiar with the Old Testament in general. But there is no statement in the New Testament that says Jesus is the second Moses, like it says the second Adam. So we might be inclined to think, well, where does that come from? Well, the reality is there's way more about Moses that connects to Christ than there is about Adam or Isaac or any of these
Well,
other
and
figures.
part of that's because there's not as many details in Genesis about Adam. It's
Right.
shorter, and
Right.
Moses is like in 3 different books.
Yeah.
Right, and he's the traditional author of
Yeah.
the first 5 books of the
And
Old
it's
Testament.
like the most important figure. But
Right.
when we look at the last book of Moses, however much of these books he wrote, clearly he didn't write the very last bit of Deuteronomy because
Right.
it's
Can't write about your own
occurs
death.
after his death. Maybe Joshua, maybe a later scribe, maybe Ezra. There's all
Right.
kinds of theories on this. But we have this this prophetic statement of a prophet that will come who will be like Moses. And I think Moses actually, I'm trying to remember, may actually deliver this prophecies maybe right before his death. And it's interesting because when we look at the Gospel of John and we see the Pharisees come from Jerusalem, or at least the people that they sent to question John the Baptist, John keeps saying, no, I'm not these things, right? I'm not the Christ. I'm not the Messiah, right? And they say, are you Elijah? Because they anticipate a return of Elijah based on a prophetic passage. No, I'm not Elijah. And they say, are you the prophet? And it's very easy for us to just kind of read over that because we think they're just saying, are you the return of some prophet?
Right.
No, they say the prophet. This is a reference to Deuteronomy because they are expecting that in the Messianic era, there will come a prophet, the one that was prophesied to be like Moses. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is, and of course, John is saying he's not any of these things, which means we need to turn our attention
And he
to
said
Christ.
he's not even the prophet.
Right.
Right.
Which Christ is. And we find this again in the same Gospel of John, right after the multiplication of the fish and the loaves, is the people saying, this really truly is the prophet who is to come into the world. They're pinpointing this specific prophet, the prophet. And then there's something apparently in their tradition that indicates there's supposed to be this amazing prophet coming. That is drawn directly from Deuteronomy. So Christ is the fulfillment of the prophet who was to be like Moses. But then you look at the things that aren't as explicitly stated, how every aspect of his life, the places he goes, the things that happen match down to the most remarkable details. And I don't want to take up time from the conversation, but here's a couple I think are cool. The big picture is obviously there. We have the people in bondage, subjugated to a foreign power, Egypt, who is ruled by a particularly wicked king, Pharaoh, whatever.
Who's
right?
not even named.
Right. Well, we go through multiple pharaohs, really, in the course of this story.
Sure.
The Messiah of the people, we first hear about as an infant. And this is at a period of time when this wicked king, afraid for his crown, has ordered all the Hebrew boys to be slaughtered.
Thrown into the Nile River.
Yeah. So we come up to Jesus and we see Israel is under foreign rule, Roman rule. The Messiah is born. There's a wicked king named Herod, and he promptly declares the slaughter of all the innocents because he's worried for his crown, right? It's the same story playing out again. So we can see some of that big picture stuff, but then some of the details are absolutely incredible. When Moses, so here's the two that I find very interesting. When Moses goes and flees into the wilderness, and then God meets him in the burning bush, right? And they have this whole conversation. God says to him that Aaron, his brother, is going to come to meet him. So Aaron comes to meet him. And of course, Moses has run because he'd gotten in trouble and Pharaoh was out to kill him. And so the first thing that Aaron tells him is, those who sought your life are dead, right? You know, the Pharaoh's gone, new Pharaoh. Skip back to the New Testament now, when the new Messiah has to flee as an infant, in this case. Joseph takes him to Egypt. What happens? Angel, after the death of Herod, appears and says to Joseph, those who sought the child's life are dead. It's almost precisely the same words.
And now it's a movement from going back to Egypt to bring deliverance, but now he's going to Israel, back from Egypt to Israel to bring full deliverance, which is different.
And I think
Right.
that brings up a really fascinating point, which maybe we'll touch on later, is the fact that here the fleeing is from Israel. There begins to be this interesting connection between Egypt and Israel, that the bondage is not so much out of a foreign power, but the bondage exists right inside of Israel. Maybe we can touch on that later. But then the other one that I think is really fascinating is we go, and these are like the tiny details. The big stuff is this there in spades. But the reason that Moses fled, if you remember, he sees one of the taskmasters beating one of his fellow Hebrews. He kills him, hides the body, thinks he's safe.
Misdirected passion, a desire for righteousness, but not doing it the way God intended.
Exactly. And the next day or so, he meets a couple of his people, fellow Hebrews, quarreling about something. And he tries to intervene. He's like, why are you all quarreling? And they say, who made you a judge over us? Are you going to kill us like you did that Egyptian? And he's like, uh-oh, this word got out. It's known that I killed this guy. And there's this really interesting scene in the New Testament where two brothers come to Christ arguing about the will. Remember this? And they're like, tell my brother to give me my share of the inheritance. And Jesus says, who made me a judge over you?
Oh, wow.
Right. Or again, when we're having the plagues, we have this reference, this very interesting reference to now the finger of God is like, I think maybe it's Pharaoh who recognizes it. It's like, this is the finger of God. And when we had our gospel passage just a few days ago was Jesus casting out demons and the Pharisees saying, oh, he's doing this by the power of Satan, by Beelzebul. And Jesus demonstrates that is not the case. And he says, but if it is not, then he says, then if it is by the finger of God that I cast them out, then the kingdom of God has come upon you, right? So we have all these little words and stuff that keep drawing our connection between those. And of course, Pentecost, the coming down of the Holy Spirit. You have Mount Tabor with Moses and Elijah there.
And they're speaking of Jesus' ultimate exodus, right?
From the word exodus is literally used there.
Yeah, that's so important. Vincent, what are your thoughts on Exodus? You haven't said too much yet. I know there's a lot on your heart about this as well.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to interrupt that.
No, this is
Isaac's very interesting.
This is critical stuff.
Connection. That was a lot of stuff I didn't.
This is all foundational, right? These are like the seeds of the story that we're getting into. So it's good.
So, gosh, so where to begin? So we left off last week with Joseph and bringing his family, all of his family, into Egypt to live in the best of the land. And then, that's where Genesis ends, right? And then Exodus pretty much picks up. Well, it pretty much says, all right, and then 400 years pass, and now, and it makes it very clear that now we have a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Of course, Joseph, 400 years, he's long dead.
Right, but
his
it's not
brothers
that he
are long
didn't
dead.
know who he was. It's different because did not know Joseph. Think of like Adam knew his wife, right? There's some deep knowledge here. Also think this new Pharaoh would have been the most well-educated man in the entire country at the time that he became Pharaoh. So he would have known the history and all the things that had happened in the ways that Egypt would have recorded them. And so for Scripture to say he did not know Joseph, it was almost like he said he chose not to honor the agreement with the family. I refuse to enter into that covenant, just as a man enters into covenant with his wife, knowing her, or other forms of knowing another, like others have used that in Scripture. But to know one another has also to do with a covenant relationship to some extent. And when he did not know Joseph, it was did not choose to enter into covenant with Joseph's people. And that's for the military threat, right? Fear of an uprising in the future. So he tried to take that down.
Yeah. And I'm sure there was also something on behalf, or not on behalf, but something to do with the Israelites themselves
Sure.
would not have known Joseph or honored their own heritage in all likelihood. I think that there was probably a great extent to which they had forgotten who they were because they'd been in Egypt for 400 years. I mean, imagine if your family is in a place that's not native to you for 400 years, you're going to have completely adopted the culture, the religion, the all of the ways of those people with whom you're living. I mean, think about, I don't know, most of my family going back is German. And then I have some Italian and some Russian and little other bits here and there. But I'd say the greater part of my family is German. I don't speak German. I wish I did. I make a pretty mean pretzel.
With beer cheese?
Please say
I've
yes.
not,
Kaiser, technically.
I've not
Beer
made.
cheese is so good.
Yeah, I love beer cheese. I've not tried to make it yet, but yeah, like I guess my point is like I know basically nothing about Germany.
Yeah.
Never been, right?
I mean, my
family's
name's
only
German too, and I don't know.
My family has
anything.
only been here in the States for I mean not even 200 years.
I'm coming up on 200 years right now. 1825, I think, is the furthest back we can trace
Dang,
the
you're
Soul
old.
family. I know,
So-
but they came from Germany, and I don't know anything
You
beyond
know,
that.
I mean at most 200 years.
Right?
So that's like double that. Right? But it's like you skip a generation pretty much, and then all of that is gone if it's not maintained. So that's kind of the context in which Exodus opens, is you have this tyrannical Pharaoh and these Hebrew people who don't, they've probably been told about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the 12 sons of Israel and all of this story. And this is how we ended up here in this land of Egypt, even though we're not from here. But yeah, they would have completely forgotten who they are and how akin to our own lives is that. Like think about, we've lived in sin for so long. We've lived apart from God for so long.
We've lived with death for so long.
Mm-hmm. And we've lived, again, everybody should keep in mind, the church is the new Israel, is the new chosen people. We have been in the culture of death for so long at this point
People just take it for
that
granted.
we assume, yeah, we have taken up the culture's gods. We've taken up this foreign land's ways.
And we're even being convinced slowly through different forms of propaganda that things that happened 300-400 years ago were different than how we learned them, were taught them.
Yeah.
There are very nefarious ideologies and agendas that are trying to shed light on legitimate abuses and difficulties that existed back then, but in a way that basically overshadows and tries to abolish entirely our sense of reverence or respect for those that came before us and gave us the freedoms we have, the culture we live in.
To
right?
borrow the title of a John Paul II encyclical, it is very difficult to have identity without memory.
Right?
It really, it is. It's so, you kind of need to know where you came from to really understand your identity in some way. And if that gets forgotten, lied about, twisted, then yeah, it's a real struggle. Vince, if I can just kind of interject, I'm so glad that you went here and took this direction. I've thought about this a number of times over the years. Grew up as a kid, if you're raised Christian and you hear the Bible stories, right? Especially those Old Testament Bible stories. And we have this, I think, this sort of illusion of a certain perfection here, amongst all these people. And there's this assumption that 400 years that they all just kept worshiping God the whole time. And I no longer think that's the case. I think the Bible gives us some clues here. And I think that it not only agrees with what you're saying, I think it may give us a very interesting perspective on what kind of rescue operation was going on here by God.
Right.
First of all, when we come to the mountain and God's delivering the law, and Moses goes up on the mountain, he's been there for 40 days. He comes down, they've created this golden calf and they're worshiping it. It's right. So this is all really bad stuff and God's about to judge them. We know the story really well. But here's the interesting detail. It's not just that they
Sleeves are up.
do what?
That's right.
Since sleeves are up.
Yeah, we're getting serious now. It's not just that they did something terrible and abandoned God, even after God had shown them all of His might. We really need to stop and think: why was it in only 40 days they decided to worship a golden cow? If they had been spending the last 400 years in Egypt worshiping the one true God, why in 40 days they suddenly switched to pagan idol
They're
worship?
like, he must have died. We're just gonna
Yeah.
pick another thing.
No,
Like that's not.
You go back instinctively to what you are familiar with.
Yes.
Was not Apis the bull god, right?
Mm-hmm.
The cows were sacred. Cows were worshipped, right? They knew this. This wasn't a new policy on the part of the people of Israel. This was reverting to what they were familiar with.
And when people are going through like an addiction and they're trying to find
Yeah.
sobriety, they get to around the 30, 40-day mark.
Mm.
And if they've never had any sobriety in their entire life, I've heard it takes between 259 and 300 some odd days just to begin the process of recovering from an addiction to anything, to kind of begin the process of just resetting the brain. And it might take as many as 5 years to have any sense of full recovery, right? If not longer. But the initial movement towards sobriety, when you first really say, this is going to stop in my life and I'm going to live differently, when you get to 30, 40, 50 days, it's like you're going to be hitting, I know that there's different forms of withdrawal that people experience,
Sure.
whether it's, it could be shopping or eating, it could be pornography and drinking and drugs, whatever it is, there's something. And so these are the false gods people worship, the greatest source of comfort they have found that will ease their pain or help them cope with different situations. And this is the golden calf worship, but now in a different form, right?
Because the moment you hit a rough spot when you're trying to go clean, like let's say something bad happens in your life, you seek for the comfort you've always known. You instinctively go back to that.
Yes.
And so I think that this is what we're seeing with the golden calf. This is not something new. I think it's something very old. I think it's something they're very familiar with. And also we have to keep in mind that the culture of all these peoples at this time, there was loads of family gods. And so I'm not saying that they had completely forgotten who God was, the God of their fathers or whatever, but they might have just been including him in the rank of all the rest, right? This might have been a very polytheistic thing. I also find it interesting that Moses is saying to God in the burning bush scene, who shall I say sent me? Shouldn't they have known, right? If this is the one God they've been worshiping all the time, right? It seems like they had lost a lot in that 400 years, and they probably adopted a lot of Egyptian culture, probably a lot of the paganism surrounding it.
That might also explain why they would have responded to the title of, obviously, say that I am sent me.
Yes.
But that so often God is referred to not merely as God, but normally as the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that there is some sort of a family God aspect to that title or to that understanding, but it's not like one of these false, idol gods.
Yeah.
Rather, there's some, this is just occurring to me, that like there's some sort of, all of Israel is related. They go back far enough. And then, then there's this sort of, in the New Testament, this one body of Christ, that we are all, in a sense, one family in Christ, that God is kind of a family God.
It is the family God.
in
He just
that
happens to
way.
be the only one.
Right.
That's really it.
And to that point as well, I think maybe some of what we're seeing there at the burning bush is God revealing himself as more than just one of the family gods, because it's like, okay, you know that I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know I'm the God your forefathers worshipped.
And that got his attention.
Right. But
Sure.
now I'm going to tell you that God, that family God, maybe you've reduced me to thinking of me as a family God, is the great I am, the one and only, the ultimate being. So it may be a case of kind of expanding that knowledge that was already there. The last thing I want to say about this is, I was actually thinking about this yesterday. There is this really interesting reality when Moses goes to Pharaoh and repeatedly says, "Let my people go." That the goal is for them to get to the promised land, right?
But he doesn't just say, "Let my people go."
Well, that's what I'm getting
Right,
to.
I figured.
The goal is to get them to the promised land, but it seems as if he's being a little bit dishonest with Pharaoh, right? He says, we want to take a little journey and go worship God.
Hey, we just want to take a 3-day retreat.
Right,
We'll
just
be back.
3 days,
Right?
go worship our God. And of course, Pharaoh's like, okay, fine, but you got to leave the women and children here. And then, after another plague, Pharaoh says, okay, you can take them, but you got to leave the cattle. And Moses says, well, we need to offer sacrifices to God.
And you wouldn't be able to handle it here.
And we won't even know which ones to sacrifice until we get there. So we really have to take our cattle too. So all this seems like Moses is being super sneaky, right? Finding a way.
Because if they did what they were supposed to do in Egypt, they would have been murdered because it would be a deicide.
Oh,
because
yeah.
they worshipped cattle, the Egyptians.
Exactly,
Yes.
yeah. So it's easy to view this as a little bit of trickery on Moses' part to get the people of Israel a few days journey outside, and then they make a run for it. But I would also argue everything he says is 100% true. Because I think that the bondage from which they were being delivered was not so much the bondage of being literal slaves, so that was
Correct.
very important, but I really think it was the bondage of false religions they had adopted. And I think this call for them to leave is very much a call to go forth into the wilderness and worship the Lord your God correctly. It really is a deliverance from pagan worship to true worship.
Even from
And-
the outset.
And I don't think Moses is really lying there. I mean, sure, he may not have been telling the whole story, but I think this really is what God was calling them to do, even though they don't ever plan on coming back, is I want you out of Egypt so you can remember how to worship me, the one true God, again.
Yes. And it's even like God's promptings to Moses to say, hey, this is how you need to tell Pharaoh. And in many ways, this is almost like if he's going to ask this of Pharaoh, odds are he also communicated this to the people. And so there's maybe even within the people who have forgotten the God of their ancestors and the true worship, that there's this resistance or indifference that Moses is fighting as well to even get them moving enough to leave the country. So, okay, you're not willing to change your entire life and start worshiping rightly. Well, maybe you just can come on a 3-day retreat. Isn't that how we oftentimes operate in like youth ministry or ministry of any kind, trying to say, hey, all right, you're not willing to get into all these terrible habits, or you're not even going to church, but you know what?
And
You want to be confirmed, why don't you just go on this retreat and we'll see what happens.
What happens those 3 days? They see the full might and power of God opening the Red Sea, destroying the Egyptians. It's like,
Right.
okay, phase 2 is going to keep getting better, and we're going on.
Right.
But yeah, to your point, John, I think that I think we have to remember that Moses does not immediately go and tackle Pharaoh. He goes first the elders of the people.
Right.
So after he receives and his concern when he's talking to God isn't just a worry about how will I talk to Pharaoh, but when he's saying, who shall I say sent me? That's in reference to, what do I tell my people? The first thing is he goes back and he tries to convince the people. That might have been almost as hard of a task as convincing Pharaoh when you think about it.
Oh, yeah.
But that is the first battle he has to face.
Yeah.
This is an interesting kind of parallel that just occurred to me while Isaac was talking, and then So, throughout the Bible, throughout Christian history, and then the broader Jewish tradition that we've inherited as Christians, there are a few characters, nations, right, that represent evil, that represent Satan, the devil. And the first is always Egypt. Egypt is always the devil, right? Pharaoh. Who's the next one?
Rome.
Rome, Caesar. Right. And in fact, that it's speculated that the 666 of Revelation that
Caesar Nero.
would spell Nero Caesar. That actually the Caesar is the beast in some sense.
And maybe between
And
those
so-
two, you have Babylon.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are a few. Right. So Babylon is kind of your other one. We touched on that a
I'd
little
say
bit
those
at
are
one
like the
point.
top three.
I think so.
But just to connect that Old and New Testament here, what was the Romans' problem with the Christians? It wasn't that the Christians worshipped Christ.
So
Because
they
they
would
actually
not
didn't-
worship
They
their
actually,
gods too.
right? They didn't care that the Christians worshipped Christ. The Romans conquered so many people who had their own gods. They could worship their own gods as
They
long
encouraged
as
incorporating
As
it all
long as
together.
you
One
worship
big pantheon
our
of
God.
gods.
Right.
As pure worship,
long
just
as-
throw some incense to ours too.
Relativism.
as long as you would burn incense to the statue of Caesar, right, and to
Oh
their
my
gods.
gosh. Okay.
And
First,
so here's the
yeah, keep going.
And so here's the thing, right? The Egyptians would not care if the Israelites worshipped the one true God. As long as you don't offend our own gods, as long as you don't kill our
problem
cows,
is the worship of the one true God is killing.
offensive.
Right.
Is offensive to the satanic pagan archetype, right? And so, there's this kind of sense in which you have this people that has lived in this pagan culture with all of these gods, with this false religion for so long, they've forgotten their own true God. They're actually just accustomed to worshiping these Egyptian gods. And then the one true God is like, hey, I'm here and I care about how you worship me. And also I'm here to set you free. First of all, it's interesting that our first reaction to that, because the Israelites are just us. It's interesting that our first reaction to that is like bitter resistance, kicking and screaming,
Yeah, because
complaining.
it's taking us out of our comfort zone. We don't want to do that.
And, and then it's like, the way in which God asks to be worshiped is offensive to the culture in which we're living. What does that sound like? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Contemporary, very familiar.
And that's what I was feeling as you were talking. It's like, this to me is today's society. Like the frustration, anger. Imagine, and we've all come from different places of conversion or reversion to our faith, right? And we've all had very different paths, right? Isaac, you shared that it was very intellectual in what you read and how you found those things at the right time, as well as some of the crazy things you went through at times. And I've shared my crazy stuff, and I was a cradle Catholic, right? But all of us also were affected in different ways by the culture of hedonism or whatever it might be. And that's manifested itself in different vices that God allowed us to fall into for greater glory when we found healing or deliverance from that. Even if there's still levels of healing and layers of deliverance we still need today, we've gone through a lot to even be capable of being here. And so imagine someone who has not gone through conversion, who has never experienced any freedom at all because they didn't or don't believe they need freedom because they are just living the life that they've inherited, they've grown up with, they're used to, the culture of indulgence in all the things we've talked about already today, whether it's shopping or eating or pornography or binge watching Netflix or social media scrolling on every platform that you could possibly have. The moment you start saying, I'm going to give these things up, meaning sacrifice these things, sports even, the moment the friends that you currently have that are also living in that lifestyle will start to look at you as like you're a murderer. You are a freak.
Yep.
You are somebody I don't want to associate with.
Yep.
You need to get away from me. And they stop hanging out with you. And you will lose friends in the process of conversion. And I think that's why so many people are scared of that change, because it forces uncomfortable experiences with the people that they are surrounded by in their immediate daily life.
And it's entering into the desert.
And that's what
You
it
do
feels
not
like.
go straight from Egypt to the promised land.
You can't.
No, you have to be. It takes those desert journeyings to be rid of the idols. Something. While you all were talking, that occurred to me as well. I think that there is. It's an observation that I think may really be. I've never thought of this before, but I want to try to kind of talk it out because it struck me as potentially very important. The scenario that we're looking at here, which I think, there's a little speculation, but I think it's probably pretty accurate. I think we've got some clues. I think we can imagine the way people are. And so we have this absorption into the culture of Egypt. And so we're thinking, well, maybe the people themselves weren't likely to accept Moses with rejoicing right off the bat. What would make them accept Moses? And here I think we see something very interesting. Had they been more comfortable, they probably would have rejected Moses completely. But they had recently been put under hard labor and were uncomfortable. And then in the course of all this, that labor is doubled down onto where they can hardly bear it anymore.
Yeah.
And so what I think we see here is a picture of something very interesting. That God often, I'm not saying he necessarily makes miserable things happen in our life, but I think he often allows them so that when the opportunity of grace comes our way, we are more likely to say, I need a change. I need out of this. This is not working for me.
Well, what he's doing is turning you over to your passions. And when you are caught up in your passions, whatever they may be,
slavery.
That is slavery. It becomes a dictatorship to a point where until your life becomes unmanageable, when your slavery is no longer comfortable but is destroying your happiness.
Because for a moment, the slavery seems okay. When you're indulging the passions, when you're indulging the addictions, when you're indulging in the sins.
Right.
But every one of them always comes back to bite you, right? Whether it be through a loss of job, loss of friendship, loss of health, transmitted diseases, whatever, right?
Well, because it's not like the Hebrew slaves were not fed.
Right.
They were very comfortable in different settings.
And we see this when they get in their desert journeyings. There's a couple of times where they remember, well, at least we had food and we kind of thought it was tasty, it was savory. We had leeks and onions and garlic and all that good stuff. So I think if they had had even more of that, they would have been very disinclined to leave. If they had adopted the Egyptian culture 400 years later, kind of forgotten about their own God, their own identity, and they'd gotten into some positions of prominence in Pharaoh's court, and Goshen is the most fertile part. It was the best of the land, and things are going great. And this Moses guy comes like some kind of street preacher saying, you need to worship the one true God again, and fire and brimstone. They'd be like, shut up, dude, go away. We're doing great. But they were in abject misery at this point. And so I think that this is a really important thing for us to remember in our own lives is God sends grace to us all the time. But it seems so often that it's when we go through miserable times that we maybe notice it. Maybe it's been there all along, but we weren't willing to listen because we'd gotten sort of comfortable.
Yes.
And we may be very upset with God for allowing things to go badly in our lives. But if we could pull back and see the big picture, we might have never left Egypt if they hadn't gone wrong.
Well, and that's also, I think I think the devil always overplays his hand. Mm-hmm. At some point, he gets so full of himself and so puffed up that he
shows his cards.
He always plays the game one step too far. Because the best strategy, which would require a deal of self-control, which the devil may just not have, I guess, would be to do that, to let them be keep them in this kind of comfortable, middle space. If we're going to draw that analogy to sin, right? It's not like you're spiritually much better off, if I have 3 mortal sins on my soul, mm-hmm. the devil is going to just try and convince me to commit a 4th and a 5th and a 6th, right? But if I have 3 mortal sins on my soul, that's enough. That's enough. I'm going to hell. If I don't repent and go to confession and all this, right?
Yeah.
But the devil will still try to convince me. to continue in that down that miserable path. And one of the Psalms, and I can't remember which one, but it's on the rotation for the Liturgy of the Hours, that those who worship other gods increase their sorrows.
Yes.
Yes. Oh my gosh. That's
and so,
it.
yeah, it's like we increase our sorrows. The question is, are we given the grace of enough humility at the crucial moment to cry out to God that we need a savior, to admit that we need a savior? Because if we don't admit that we need a savior, God can do nothing for us.
And I think of this as God giving us multiple moments. It's not just one big moment. I mean, sometimes it builds to a big moment, but only because we rejected all the other small moments, and God had to get our attention in a bigger way.
I think they were there kind of like knocking on the door all along. We just weren't listening.
Right.
So this brings up some really interesting thoughts about this whole idea of slavery, which I got some thoughts I'd love to share. I have drained my water, though. Perhaps we could take a
let's take a quick break. That'll be great.
Yeah.
Let's do it. All right, everybody, we will be back with more Spirit Inspire shortly after this. Hey everyone, this week's episode is sponsored by Family Renewal Project. FRP is a local theology of the body apostolate in service to the Archdiocese of Louisville. They're dedicated to renewing the culture through the renewal of the family. They have so many amazing things going on, so check them out at familyrenewalproject.com. All right, everybody, welcome back to Spirit Inspire. We're going back to Egypt in slavery, but hopefully not for real in our lives. But it's been a very, very powerful conversation already so far, just getting into the Exodus and who Moses was and what his calling meant for the people of Israel and how they responded to it, not just counting how Pharaoh responded and the just basic plot, but even the significance of why these things happened. I think science often asks the how and when. Catholics, Christians ask the who and why, right? And I think this is what we're getting into, right? The plot is important, but there's depth to the plot because how does that story actually impact our story? And we've already unpacked a lot of that, and there's more depth to go. So with the Exodus, the thought to me was the idea of Moses encountering God in the burning bush that set him on this journey, right? The reason he was even there in the land of Midian, of course, is because he had killed the Egyptian and he fled for his life, and he was now in, quote, exile in Midian for 40 years. So he, on some level, experienced his own wilderness, his own wanderings, well before he even became a leader of a people who would also experience the wanderings. So he kind of had a double wandering, which is kind of rough for him, right? But while he's in Midian, he's already married with children. He's a shepherd for his father-in-law's flock, Jethro. And then he stumbles upon this profound, unexplainable phenomenon of a bush on fire, but it's not being destroyed or consumed like fire normally does. And I mean, when do you ever see that? I don't think it's very common or even possible. Yeah. And so this draws him in, and because he was drawn to it, God was delighted and allowed Moses to encounter him. And it was this, Moses, take off your sandals because you are standing on holy ground. The only other time before this moment that anyone was standing on holy ground was in the Garden of Eden, right? In Genesis. And so, like, for the entirety since the fall, there was no moment of holy groundness. Even when Abraham encountered God, God did not reveal his true name in that moment. He only did so to Moses.
I think there's a hint of it with Jacob at Bethel.
Yes, there's a hint of it.
Because he says, surely this is the house of God. This is, doesn't he actually say it's the holy ground or something along those lines? There's, and that's interesting as well. And I'm actually glad you said that because I'd never made this connection between those two passages before. Mm-hmm. The burning bush, And actually, right before the break, we're talking a little bit about slavery, and hopefully we have a moment. I'd like to come back to share a thought on that. But the burning bush is fantastic. So the burning bush was kind of viewed by the church fathers as a symbol of the incarnation. And I think that's right. It makes sense. We hear of God being a consuming fire. We hear that no man can look on God and live. And so the fire here representing the divinity, which would typically consume our humanity. We're not capable of that.
But in this case, it burns away the impurities.
Well, in this case, it's not burning at all, this
Right.
particular bush. And we may,
Right.
and you mentioned this. It's something we may forget. We think that Moses just saw, oh, there's a bush on fire, I'm going to look at it. No, the passage is very clear. He turned aside to see why the bush wasn't consumed. I'm sure he'd seen burning things before, but this one is not normal. This one is not burning up. And so the church fathers see this as the incarnation, because the divinity of God, united with the humanity of Christ, there is no destruction of that humanity, right? As we would think should occur if the greatness of God came into contact with our humanity. But beyond that is also what God says through the burning bush. This is where God reveals his name as the I am. And Jesus, of course, comes to save us, but in one sense, the most central thing, one of the most central things we can say about Christ is that he reveals God to us, who God is. He is the image of God. And so all through the Old Testament, there's this idea of the name of God, and names reveal to us, or meant to reveal to us, who a person is. You know, in Hebrew, in the Bible, to the Jews, right, names are very, very important. They're not just, kind of like fun names.
Well, the very first gift we
receive.
receive as human beings, right?
It's the gift of a name.
Other than our life itself, right?
And so in the burning bush, you have this natural material object that is not consumed. And through this, God speaks his name. He reveals himself to Moses. And so you can really see why the church fathers viewed this as a symbol of the incarnation, because it is through Christ that God is revealed to us. But then just thinking now of that connection with Jacob at Bethel, this was also the traditional interpretation of that passage, is that Jacob's ladder is the incarnation, right? The connection between God and man.
That's so
So
good.
both the cases where we have this sort of holy ground here is incarnational, are scenes that prefigure Christ in
Yes.
some way.
Yes, and so this is before Jacob left the promised land the first time into exile, when he experienced this extreme at Bethel.
Yeah, he's on the run from immediately.
It's not the moment he's wrestling with the angel
Right,
20
this is
years
prior-
later
this is prior to
on
that,
his way
yeah.
home. Yeah. And so, yes, there's some level of holy ground type encounter taking place here. But I don't know if the angel himself says that, right? He is saying this is definitely holy ground because of what I've experienced.
Right, yeah. It's
But
Jacob
God himself
Jacob that
isn't
says that.
declaring it holy, and that
Yeah.
might be the difference, right? But yet, because even there, when he says, when he erects the rock
Mhm.
and says, "If you bring me back home, then I will make you my God." Right now, you're the God of my father,
Yeah.
Abraham
as
and
if it's
Isaac.
like an option, like he's bartering with God.
Yeah, exactly.
Jacob's
It's
always
like,
bartering.
"All right, God, if you bring me back,
Laban,
I'll
with
claim you
God,
as my
but-
own, dude."
yeah.
Like, that's not how it
God's
works.
like, yeah,
but,
it's not what I was looking for here.
but yet, that's where he did bring him back.
And I don't want to. I
Sure.
don't want to talk too much, but could we just briefly step back to this question of the slavery that we see here in Egypt?
Sure.
Vince, you mentioned earlier the importance of Egypt as a type in the Bible. So I've had this thought for a long time, and I'm actually happy to have an opportunity to share it with you all and see what you think here. That the slavery, there's a little bit more here than we may easily assume. We've already talked about how this whole story is a prefigurement of salvation history, and particularly the coming of Christ. And we've talked about how we can see all of these similarities, these parallels between Exodus and the Gospels, including the fact that in both cases, the people were under foreign rule, under foreign subjugation. But I would ask this question. If that's the case, and we have Moses going to Pharaoh and saying, "Let my people go." How many times in the gospel does Jesus go to Caesar and say, "Let my people go"? None.
Right?
How many times, in fact, does Jesus go railing about the persecution of the Romans? He doesn't.
He never does. Yeah.
Okay. But he does have a lot to say about slavery and persecution. So think of the taskmasters of Egypt. What were they doing? They were doubling down on the loads, right? They're crushing the face of these people into the earth, giving them burdens that they could not possibly bear. And what does Jesus say? You bind heavy burdens on men's shoulders, and you will not lift a finger to help them. Who's he talking to? Not the Romans, the Pharisees.
Pharisees.
Who gets the brunt of his anger? Who gets the brunt of John's anger? The Pharisees, the scribes, the Pharisees, over and over.
I wonder what the etymology of Pharisee is in its relation to Pharaoh.
I don't know.
I don't know if there
think there's
is,
one,
but just the sounding
it is
in our
interesting.
language is interesting.
It seems that there is a real sense of bondage and slavery here that is not the bondage and slavery of a foreign country. It's not, in fact, even the bondage and slavery of paganism, as we may be seeing in the case of Egypt, but rather the bondage of a false form of worship. And the two things I'd like to kind of say along with that is this. I was listening some months ago to an interview, a conversation between Bishop Barron and a young man who was an atheist. And Bishop Barron makes the point that you really don't hear much about atheism in the Bible. And he was saying this in the context of we all have our own gods we worship, whether we believe in God or not. You know, all of us, there's this innate sense of really wanting something to be devoted to in our lives. And he said the Bible is all about false worship. It's comparing true worship with false worship, you know, true God with false gods. It's not pitting this God against atheism. It's God against false gods. And I think he's really right on that. In fact, besides the one verse in the Psalms, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God, I can't really think of any other statements throughout the Bible that relate to not believing in God at all. And so I think we can say that there is this thing that runs throughout the scriptures of the true God versus the false gods, but also the true worship of the true God versus the wrong sort of worship, whatever that might mean. And then to your point, Vince, about Egypt, if we jump to the book of Revelation, we have the story of the two witnesses. And remember, they are slain after 3 days, they're raised up. The passage there says, and this is really fascinating, their bodies laid in the streets of the great city.
For 3 days.
3 days, which is spiritually called Egypt and Sodom. So spiritually, right, this means, and this is the metaphorical name of the city, not its real literal name, but its metaphorical name, indicating on one hand, to your point, Vince, Egypt, right, something, well, in Sodom, pure corruption, right? These are very evil, very negative.
Yeah, it's not just the name of a political country with sovereignty, right?
And the very finish of that sentence says, where also their Lord was crucified. Where was Jesus crucified? Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
Their bodies laid in the streets, the great city, which is spiritually called Egypt and Sodom, where also their Lord was crucified. Think about that for a moment.
Jerusalem.
So think of Galatians. Paul says, "O foolish Galatians, who bewitched you that you would be again entangled in a yoke of bondage," right? He's referring to false religion here. And these are Christians, but they become works-focused. They've forgotten about grace, right? And so Paul is reminding them, this is what we see with the Pharisees, with their binding burdens on men's backs.
In many ways, this is what we see today.
Yeah. Who was, and I'm not saying this, and this might sound a little bit politically incorrect, which I'm not, because this is nothing, in no way a reference to the Jews or the Jewish people. But there's been a focus in modern times to focus in on the Romans in their part of crucifying Christ.
Sure.
And there's a very good reason why that's happened. It's because it's a response to extreme forms of racism that happened, say, with the Nazis, where they refer to the Jews as Christ killers. So there was this instinctive sense on the part of people who had greater sensibility
Backing away
to
from
say
that.
we want to back away from
Yeah,
that.
because you don't want it to lead to the Holocaust. I mean, that's
Precisely.
horrific.
And so, but the thing is, you can talk about a historical reality without ever saying, well, it applies to this entire group of people, past, present, and now. And the reality is, when you read the Gospels, the people responsible for Jesus getting crucified were the religious leaders. Not, I mean,
Correct.
even to some extent, even Pilate was just a pawn in their hands at this point. I mean, nobody can read the story and say the Romans were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. It was the Jewish leaders that were, the Jewish religious leaders.
Yeah, you can't even say it was the Jewish people. I
No,
mean,
you can't.
mob rule was
There was
only
some of
based.
that,
There was
but
some of that,
It
but
was all
on the
influenced
level,
by the leaders,
all influenced by the
the
leaders.
Pharisees, the scribes, and all of this.
I mean, it's easy to get mob rule by simply having leaders who appoint people.
Mhm.
They could be spies, they could be hired hands to literally be planted in a crowd, saying the right things, riling up the right people in ways that make it seem like everybody believes this to make things like that happen.
Yeah. And so I think what we really need to see here, and I think this is really very important, the deliverance which Christ brings as the Messiah, as the new Moses, the deliverance is there for all people. But he is also at odds with somebody, much as Moses was at odds with Pharaoh. Except it's not Rome, it's not Caesar. It's the religious leaders of his own people over and over again. His exodus comes about at their hands. The sacrifice of the lamb of the Passover comes about at their hands.
They're the ones who lord their power over others,
Right.
keeping the door closed and
look
not
at-
even being
Look
willing
at John
to enter
the Baptist.
themselves.
Look at John. Where does he go in preparing the way? He goes to the Jordan River, which was, that was the entry point to the Promised Land. But now it's as if he's saying, you need to come out. So you see, Israel has become Egypt. And I have read, I need to study the geography, but I have read that he was on the other side of the Jordan. He actually led the people out of Israel to then get them baptized so they can go back into the Promised Land.
Whoa.
But there is this real sense here of
Huh.
that it is Israel has become Egypt rather than it being the foreign power. And I just think there's a lot in there that could be broken open about the bondage that we experience in our own lives, ideas of false religion, what Christ came to free us from. Yes, God is often freeing people from miserable situations in their lives. But it's not always about, I don't like the political system, or we're under control by a foreign country. There's something far deeper and spiritual inside of ourselves that we need to be freed from.
even in
The-
our Catholic parishes.
Yeah.
It that actually reminds me of something, John, that you said. I don't know if you said it on the last episode, or I think you did, and you also said it a couple other times.
I say a
At
lot of
work and
things, so I
stuff.
can't really
You do,
remember.
my friend.
But that it's
And they're
it's
good.
one thing to get Israel out of Egypt, and it's a different thing entirely to get Egypt out of Israel.
Yeah.
And that
You
is
take the boy out of the country, but you can't get the country out of the boy.
Right, except
That's-
country's good in this
Yeah.
stage.
Sure.
Egypt ain't.
But so if you consider that Egypt is that type of evil, then yeah, like that it's not all of the Levitical laws, the laws that God was giving the people in the desert through Moses, were not there as absolutes in themselves, but were there to train the
Mhm.
the people of Israel to accept the teaching of Christ, that it's not what goes into the body which defiles, but that which comes forth from the heart.
Yes.
Yes,
And-
it comes down to our desires, our attractions. Like, this is what ethos means. You know?
Sure.
We have this concept of what attracts us and what repulses us, and it's in the depth of the human heart. Which, in Scripture, when you read the word Jerusalem, we're talking about the capital of Israel, the central place of worship. And so, when we think, okay, Israel is referring to us, well, not just us collectively, but even us individually. You are Israel. You are Israel. All of us are, individually as well as collectively. And so if Jerusalem's the capital, there's some level of, at the very heart of each one of us, in the depth of our hearts even, because then you think about the Holy of Holies that would have been in Jerusalem at that time, within the temple. There's some level of Christ wanting to enter into the very depths of our hearts, untwisting these twisted up desires, attractions, and things that we are repulsed by that we shouldn't be, and things that we're attracted to that we shouldn't be, and not trying to change just our behavior, but trying to change our very desire. The reason we hate the speed limit is so much is because we desire to break the speed limit. And if we change our desires toward these things that our Egyptian culture of today emphasizes or indulgence in, then we have to recognize that we don't have the power to do that. Only Christ does. But we do have the power to cooperate with his transforming power. And that's what I think Exodus is really meant to show us, that ultimate untwisting of these cultural lies that bombard us and hold us back, hold us captive, right? And that's not just politically or socioeconomically or even with special interest groups. We're even talking within the church, even in the Catholic world, right?
We haven't yet mentioned what Israel means.
Ooh.
That Israel means
This is so good.
God perseveres.
Okay. I
God
was thinking of wrestling.
God perseveres. Well, there's so much to that.
Well, wrestling requires perseverance, so there's some relation.
Sure.
there.
Also, translating things gets a little bit hairy, but
Yes.
God perseveres. Okay. Let's
Wandering in the desert.
think about that. Here's another way,
Perseverance.
maybe, because there's, like I said, there's a lot to unpack with that idea of God perseveres. But just think about first of all, the whole history of Israel. But maybe one way to think about God perseveres, one might also say, the gates of hell shall not prevail.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a similar idea. I'm not saying that that's the full extent of the meaning of that name, but that is true that, again, the church is the new Israel. God perseveres. God triumphs in the end.
And the sacred liturgy is meant, I think, to create the environment by which God's people work out their salvation in fear and trembling, but also with that posture of receptivity. Because this is, in the new Israel, the church, the liturgy is the Mass, the Eucharist, the Supper of the Lamb, right? And so there's this marriage of heaven and earth that we're seeing. So earth is meant to be this open posture of receptivity to the gift that is the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. And when we receive that, it is meant to begin that and continue to transform our desires, our attractions, and so that we are capable of right worship. This is only a continuation of Exodus, even today.
Mm.
So much to unpack.
Yeah, and it's interesting too to notice that it was not long after Pentecost that the apostles, for the most part, very quickly have to leave Judea. Right, they go out.
Right.
There's that exodus that they experience as well.
I do love
And
that. I'm fascinated about what you said about that.
And I think the question of this is, because it does seem clear to me that there is a very real sense in the gospel stories. And well, we touched on this earlier, and I said I wanted to come back to it. Now, perhaps it makes more sense to realize why, if we draw the analogy between Moses and Jesus. Moses has to flee out of Egypt because the king seeks his life, only to return later to rescue his people. Christ, as an infant, has to flee from those who will seek his life out of Israel into Egypt, only to return to rescue his people in Israel. You see how the script is flipped. It seems so clear that Israel has become Egypt, and the taskmasters are these false religious leaders, which brings the great question. I know our time's kind of coming to a close here, but it brings a great question then, because Jesus, John, to some extent, some of the apostles later on, they're pretty strong about having problems with these religious leaders. But we also know that up until the time of Christ, this was the true religion, right? And Christ, it was simply a matter of fulfilling that true religion. So what was wrong then? What are they do? What are they doing wrong? What is really the heart? What is the Pharaohism, if I can you create a phrase, that is within the hearts of these people? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that just a couple of things we've talked about and the passages we've referenced begin to give us an idea. First is Christ talking about the burdens that they bind upon men's shoulders, and he talks about them closing the way to the kingdom of heaven against people. I think it is this extreme legalism. I think that is an extreme, making it really impossible for people to fulfill the will of God by adding all these extra rules, because they did.
Mhm.
They went way beyond the law in the Old Testament. The Pharisees, in fact, interesting enough, are particularly responsible for this. And I'll just quickly share this. I can't remember if I've shared this story before in the podcast, but it comes back to me now. A number of years ago, in my restaurant, we were doing a dinner. It was a special dinner. So it was reservation only, 5 courses, all set. It wasn't an order off the menu kind of thing. And one of my regulars had called and booked in a reservation for 3 people for the dinner. And once in a while, we'll get a dietary restriction. We'll say, well, this is a set menu, but if you let us know far enough advance, we can tweak a dish for 1 person. So she walks in, and it's like on the dot when the dinner's supposed to start. And she has this look of panic in her face, and she pulls me aside. She says, Isaac, I forgot to talk to you about this beforehand. But my friends here, the 2 ladies she brought, are Orthodox Jews, and they're completely kosher. And I thought, oh my goodness, we're putting food up right now for the first course. And I'm racking my mind to think of what's on the menu, what's not kosher. And I'm like, there's bacon on the salad course. We can leave that off. And I think that's fine. I think that's the only thing we got to worry about. And I said, but let me check. And so the 2 ladies at the table said, well, we can't have this. Okay, we can't have this particular dish with dairy in it. And I thought, I'm not aware of this being a kosher law. And then she said, well, we could have that provided we don't have this fish dish at the beginning. I'm even more confused.
What?
And then she says, oh, this is like a ceviche, so it's raw fish. And I said, yeah. Okay, then we can have both of those. And so, of course, like the rest of the night, I'm spending just like working with the kitchen to make sure everything goes all right. And I was very confused. I know there's more than just not eating pork to kosher laws. But this one was, I was just like, I'm not aware of this. Sometime later was when I found out. There's the commandment in the Old Testament, sort of kosher laws, we might call them, not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Okay?
Right. I've always wondered what this is.
And so forgetting what the reason was behind all of that, when we get to the time of the Pharisees did something that was very interesting. They were pretty convinced that the Messiah would not come until everybody was following the law to a T. So their goal was to make sure that nobody in Israel is breaking the law. And they were worried about accidentally breaking the law. So there was not much room for the idea of
charity,
innocence,
mercy,
or just like you innocently made a mistake, right?
Right.
So I forget the Jewish term, the Hebrew term for this, but they did what was called putting a fence around Torah to protect it. So they added more additional rules to keep you from accidentally breaking the rules that were in the Torah. These were their own additions, right? These are not to be found in the scriptures. And so there's this question of, well, you're not supposed to boil a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, what does that mean exactly? Does that refer only to goats or to any kind of meat? Should you not cook meat with cheese? Is that a thing? And so they said, well, let's just avoid, and is it like really boiling the kid in its mother's milk? Or what if you were cooking something with milk over here and you're cooking your goat over here and you accidentally splash some milk on the goat? Is that enough to break the law? So we have to put a fence around it. We have to make sure this never accidentally happens. So the rule became that you don't do they can eat meat and they can eat cheese, but you don't do cooked meat and dairy products at the same time or in the same location in case of cross-contamination. So if you go to some places where you have wealthier Orthodox Jewish families, like let's say in New York, you will find their houses or apartments frequently have 2 kitchens to avoid this. There's a dairy kitchen on one end and there's the meat kitchen on the other end.
Wow.
Okay. Now that was a long-winded, but it's the point I'm getting at is this is putting the fence around Torah. This is adding to the law God gave. This is binding heavy burdens which no man can bear, and you won't lift a pinky to help them. You're talking about poor people who are scrounging around for their living, can barely probably make it to the temple, who you're demanding temple tax, all these things from them. You're living high up here with all, you probably got people cooking your kosher meals for you, right? You're just piling burdens on these people to where it's impossible for them to enter the kingdom of heaven in their own minds, because they can never fulfill all the rules that you've added to this.
Yes.
And you're sitting up there like, aren't we great? So I don't know the full answer to the question, but I feel like this is a lot of Jesus' anger here. I think this is a lot of that Pharaoh and taskmaster effect, is this extraordinary legalism, adding a million rules that weren't there, not having any charity, not understanding forgiveness and mercy. What does Jesus say to them? Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He directs that specifically to these same religious leaders.
I think it's one of the most critical lines in all of Scripture in some way, to desire mercy, not sacrifice.
You think of us as Catholics, we have a fair number of rules.
Yeah.
But they're always tempered with this idea of charity and mercy. So like, okay, we fast on Fridays during Lent. We abstain. We don't eat meat. Okay. I, woke up and forgot that it was Friday and nibbled a piece of bacon in the fridge. Oh, I'm going to hell. No, says the church. You forgot. It's an innocent mistake, right? This is the charity that's lacking on the part of the Pharisees, it seems.
Yes.
Yeah. I think like so many things, it probably comes down to a worship of self in many ways. And I say this as something of a recovering Pharisee myself, like
Right. Aren't
I'm
we
an
all?
ongoing one, unfortunately.
I don't know. I because what's nested in all of that, but the belief that I can satisfy God with my own little trifling, whatever achievements.
The tithing of mint and rue and cumin.
That somehow, I'm doing the will of God by scrupulously, like following all of these little rules, that it's missing the forest for the trees. And we do that primarily when we're self-focused and when we assume that we kind of have that on our own. And so, it's like a multi-step or multi-tiered thing, because you sort of, first of all, nested in that is this assumption that you even can do any of that on your own. And then you get to, well, I'm the only one that can do this. But then also somehow maintain the belief that everyone also must live exactly like I do at all times, and that we all have to have the same sort of attitude of doing I don't know. You see what I'm saying? So it kind of gets to a point where all of a sudden the focus is on me.
Yeah.
And not on God.
Yeah.
And we've missed that. Not just the forest, but the
charity.
entire world for the trees. And it kills charity, which is the entire summation of the law to begin with.
What is it Jesus says? Those who are forgiven much love much. And so I thank you for saying that, Vince, because I've thought this a million times myself. This sort of self-righteousness is closed down to the idea of mercy. When and it's not always self-righteousness. Sometimes, because I've dealt a lot with scrupulosity. So it's not even thinking I'm righteous. Often that scrupulosity makes me feel like I'm constantly failing to be righteous. But there's with this sort of legalism and fear, which is excluding the mercy of God. And if I will not accept the mercy of God in my own life, it's very interesting. We stop being merciful towards other people. If I won't accept charity, we cease being charitable. And I can think about times where if I'm a little bit more willing to accept mercy for myself, it seems to soften me up towards other people's little faults and peccadillos, peccadillos, did I say it right? Whatever. But, I just remember this one little case when I was kind of early on coming to the church. I'd gone through this period of time where I'd gone on this really ascetical kick, right? Trying to do lots of fasting and stuff. And it was not being done out of some loving motivation. It wasn't done because I love God. I was really just trying to fix myself. And then I became super scrupulous, and I felt I had to add on more and more rules and more things to do and more time to my prayer and fast more regularly and all of this. And so I hadn't actually quite entered the church yet. I was there intellectually, but I hadn't finished going through RCIA. And I remember seeing an elderly priest at some particular church. And you know what I noticed about him? He was plump. He had a belly. And I thought, he's not doing much fasting. He's indulging himself. I had this immediate
Oh my gosh.
gut reaction, right? This is how, you want to talk about critical. This is how critical I was. I saw his extra 15 or 20 pounds, and I thought, he's not a holy man. Of course, he ended up becoming, based on my first spiritual director, married my wife and I consider him one of the holiest men I've ever known, because I got to know him finally. Of course, not to mention the fact when you're about 80 and have bad knees and a bad back and can't exercise, even if you eat a limited amount, you put on some weight, but it doesn't matter the reason. I am not here to judge people. That's not what I am not here to look at you and your weight and say if I think you're overindulging yourself or not. You might have a medical thing. You might have a, hyperactive, some kind of plan. I don't know. Or you may genuinely be overeating, and I don't know the struggles you're going through in your life. Guess what? I overeat frequently. I eat out of boredom. I do all these things. But when I would have no mercy on myself, when I thought God was demanding this level of Pharisaical righteousness from me, then I viewed everybody else in the same way. You are not following something to a T. You're not being perfect. You are therefore a bad person. And at times in my life when God's been able to break in a little bit and show me some mercy, I feel so much more like telling people, I understand what you're going through. Of course, we don't get this all perfect. It's fine. We're going to,
At the end of the
you
day,
just feel
I think,
more loving towards people.
At the end of the day, I think Exodus is meant to help us find divine mercy. Because that's the only thing that actually brings us to deliverance. The ocean of mercy is what that is. And we're in that beautiful space of obviously ending today's episode, but recognizing the path through the Red Sea is the path into the heart of Christ, which necessitates a wilderness of purging and relearning how to live and how to love. But it is the greatest journey ever for any person. So, last thought, Vincent?
His yoke is easy and his burden is light.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is.
It's the only homily I've ever heard Father Tony Breen over at St. Louis Bertrand deliver more than once is on that passage. And he talks about being basically spiritually fit. And it was a very interesting take on the passage. I think we can simply say the passage means, compared to the burden of slavery, right? His burden is light. And the fact that he's there, a yoke, that's for 2 oxen, right? It means Christ is beside you, so he's sharing it with us. But I do love Father Tony's take on this. He says, you look around at your life and you say, well, I'm trying to do the right thing, and that's causing me challenges with my job or this or that, and all the sufferings that we experience. He said, it doesn't seem light or easy, does it? And he said, well, if you're like into fitness and you go and try to work out, it seems really heavy. The reason it starts feeling lighter is because you've gotten stronger. And he uses an example of talking about like developing virtue and being spiritually fit.
That
was very interesting. Yeah. It was very, very interesting take on that passage.
That's the Exodus, right?
Yeah.
That's the journey in the wilderness. His yoke is easy, his burden is light, because he is meek and humble of heart, and he wants to train us to be the same. And it takes a long time to get there, everyone. So we will continue our conversations with Exodus at the appropriate time, however God wills it, right? This is Spirit Inspire. So just like the wind, you don't know where it's coming or where it's coming from. So too our episodes oftentimes feel like, but God knows what he's doing, and we do our very best to cooperate with that. We just ask that you continue to pray for us, and we will pray for you. We, of course, are all praying for Israel and all the suffering that people are going through right now, especially those who are trapped there, who are trying to get back to their loved ones, both in the United States, the Archdiocese of Louisville, and anywhere else. So God bless you all, and we will see you next week on another episode of Spirit and Spire.